How can one of the most successful, transformative aircraft in history, the 747, partner up with one of the most iconic airlines in aviation history, and that plane be the key reason behind the airline failing? This is the wild story about why Pan Am failed and what happened to the airline. Pan Am was founded March 14, 1927 by Henry Hap Arnold, Carl Spaatz, and John Jowett. Those three guys were the founders of the airline, but the guy behind the airline, the real visionary of what made that airline famous and iconic, was Juan Trippe. You might remember him if you saw the Aviator movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio. The role of Juan Trippe was played by Alec Baldwin in that movie. To put it in perspective of just how fast it was for this airline to be up and running in 1927, well, just a few years earlier, the Wright brothers were actually able to do the sustained flight off the ground. So we're only talking about 23, 24 years from the plane first being able to have sustained flight with that glider to today having an airline that's up and running, with Pan Am being one of the most iconic ever. It's a really short time frame. Put it in perspective, in today's age, you're talking about 9/11. If you're old enough to remember 9/11, imagine that's the very first time that anybody ever had man be able to be some type of sustained flight, and then now you're having airlines that are going. It's crazy, crazy fast. Juan and his team initially started their scheduled flying from Key West to Havana on float planes. They used several different planes along this route during this time, but as you can see, they were all planes specifically designed to land on water. Now, like everything, when you have fast evolution, there's going to be problems. And as you can imagine with aviation, you're having an issue with mechanics, reliability, and things like that. So from a pilot's perspective, having a plane that lands on water when you're doing a run from Florida, the Keys, down to Havana, it's water everywhere, which means everywhere is a runway. So having an issue with mechanical issues of engines failing or any of that type of stuff isn't really a big deal when you can always land just about anywhere. That's one of the great things about float planes, as long as you're over water, of course. You can land pretty much anywhere as long as you have a wide enough body of water, and an ocean typically works. Keep in mind, most of these passengers grew up riding on horses, so the idea of them getting into a plane would be terrifying. So you can imagine if people were dying because engines were failing and planes were crashing, that would be a big issue. But Juan still had to come up with an idea of, how do I get people to go from when they grew up horse and carriage and buggies, how do I get them to be willing to jump on this flying machine? Well, luckily for Juan, this started. Prohibition. Trippe saw the Prohibition as a great opportunity. With the US outlawing the consumption of alcohol, he knew he had a way to get people to get onto planes. He was able to tell people, hey, you can't drink here in America, but jump on this plane, we'll fly on down to Cuba, and then you can drink all that you want. And guess what? Business was good. Within 3 years, Pan Am had routes linking the United States to Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Belize, Panama, and Colombia. And what do you do when business is good? Well, if you're a good businessman, you keep investing in that business. And that's what they did. And over the next couple decades, they became the leader in aviation. By the 1950s, Pan Am was running routes to every major continent, except Antarctica. Pan Am wasn't just selling destination tickets like you see airlines doing now just to safely get you to your destination. They were selling a lifestyle. They were kind of like the Kardashians of the day. They were selling you this glamorous lifestyle, and they wanted to ensure, start to finish, you were happy with your experience. In what is now JFK Airport Terminal 3 was the Pan Am terminal, and they wanted to ensure your experience, start to finish, was magical. After your very pleasant experience in an airport terminal, you then boarded a very spacious aircraft. It was basically like hanging out in a high-end hotel that was taking you to another high-end hotel. And one of the key things that Pan Am did very well was make sure that their brand ambassadors that you dealt with as a passenger gave you a great experience. So the flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were called, were handpicked in order to ensure you had the best possible experience. You probably remember this scene from Catch Me If You Can when flocks of women were applying for the opportunity to work there.
We'll be traveling at 6,000 miles per hour at an altitude of 300 feet.
At the time, being a stewardess wasn't considered something you would do for a long time. The stewardesses were going to be able to travel the world, hang out with their friends, and have this very glamorous lifestyle. And then they were planning to date and marry a pilot, maybe meet someone that was sitting in business, going on a business trip somewhere. They would meet somebody in one of these things through their profession. They would go off, have kids, and that would be the end of it. They'd be doing it for a few years, enjoy their early 20s, and that was the end. Because that Pan Am experience was so great, Pan Am really started to grow rapidly and build partnerships with Boeing. Pan Am became the launch customer for the Boeing 707, which is how Pan Am was able to reduce travel time on the longer international flights. They started being able to get from JFK to Paris in just 8 hours. And remember how I said that they wanted every part of your experience to be luxurious, from the terminal all the way to your hotel? Well, they had their own terminal there in JFK and some of the other airports. Obviously, on their planes, they had a lot of control over who you dealt with and how that experience was. But what about when you got to your destination? Well, they owned a hotel chain. Pan Am invested in the creation of what is now the Intercontinental Hotel chain because they wanted to ensure that every part of your experience was great. And as Pan Am started to grow with some of these larger aircraft, they were able to start offering economy, because prior to that, it was really only for the rich and famous to be able to get onto a plane. But with the creation of the economy class with these bigger jets, they were able to make it for the everyday Joe to be able to get on and fly and go see something outside of their town. And back at that time, people showed up and traveled in style. My aunt, who was a flight attendant in the 70s, told me even at that time people were wearing suits, but especially during this time. And it wasn't just the first class passengers that were wearing suits. Everybody dressed up if they were going to get on a plane and go somewhere. And I'm not sure how 60 years later we ended up with this in air travel. But back to Pan Am. Now, Tripp resigned as the CEO and stepped back from that role, even though he had some involvement with the board in 1968. By the 1970s, Pan Am became the pioneer flyer of my beautiful girl, the 747. And with her, they started transporting 11 million people a year around the world. The 747 revolutionized air travel because of her capacity, allowing for hundreds of people to get on a plane for their very first time, and allowed the airline to fly even further at a reduced cost. Pan Am bought a bunch of 747s since they were the launch customer, and they bought a bunch of them for only $500 million. That was their budget. Today, $500 million is only going to get you one 747-8, if you could still buy one. Now, the 747-8 isn't $500 million, it's cheaper than that, but if that was your budget, $500 million, then you could really only afford to buy one, because you're not going to get two with $500 million at today's prices. And the 747, she is a beautiful plane, but she is thirsty. She drinks a lot of fuel. This is a video from one of my vlogs, but you can see when we're taking on fuel, this is how much we're taking on, and that's in tons of fuel, which can be a pretty big price tag. And according to my friend's dad, who was a 747 pilot for Pan Am, what he said is what they used to do when they were talking about fueling up the jets is they would actually put trash cans over at the end of the wings, and they would just fill it up and fill up the wings until the wings were fully full and the fuel started coming out of those jettisons, basically. So they went everywhere topped off. They didn't care. Fuel was inexpensive, and they didn't want to have to worry about going somewhere and being tight on fuel. They wanted to be able to hold or fly at whatever speed they wanted. They have all the options in the world, and they didn't care that it cost money to haul that fuel around, because fuel was really not a consideration in the early 70s. That, of course, changed. In 1973, there was an oil crisis that happened, and fuel prices started going up fast. And in less than a year, oil prices had gone up over 400%. And with Pan Am's fleet being designed for doing long-haul international flying, especially on a 4-engine aircraft, it had a great impact on Pan Am's overall budget. And it wasn't just Pan Am that was having problems with the fuel. Your everyday person was having to drive to work, and guess what? That was impacting their bank account as well. With the economy slowing down, the demand for this fancy, luxurious international air travel started going down as well. And Pan Am started to fly these jets around, sometimes only half full. By the mid-1970s, it was estimated that Pan Am was over $1 billion in debt. And that was when $1 billion meant something, and the governments weren't just giving that away to different people because they were like, oh yeah, you need some help, here's $1 billion. $1 billion in the mid-1970s really meant a lot of money. So back in the boardroom, Pan Am started looking for a way that they could beef up their domestic flying and be able to increase their profitability and improve their network to get people from some of the smaller places inside the US to places like JFK to get on their long-haul international flights, which is kind of like what you see now with the regional carriers. You have those smaller regional planes getting you to those bigger places, bigger airports, JFK, LAX, Miami, and they're getting you to those hubs so they can get you on their big, long international flights so they can make their money. So those little flights they don't really make much on, the big international flights was where their money was coming from. So that model still exists today. At that time, they started looking at these airlines that were doing that smaller flying, and those airlines were United and American Airlines. But they were unable to acquire those. They ended up acquiring an airline called National. Now, when you merge two airlines together, and I have been a part of it, I have seen it growing up, when you merge two airlines together, you're merging two very different cultures typically together. And they rarely go well. You have very different personalities. You have different ways that different people at different airlines do everything. For an example, at my airline, we merged with an airline that had 777s. We're on the 7-4. At one hotel, everybody on the 7-4, we always meet on a certain floor. The lobby on this hotel is on like the 24th floor or something like that. So we always meet there. And a friend of mine was deadheading on one of the 777 planes. He was up at that lobby waiting for everybody. Everybody on the 777 apparently met down on the ground floor. So you just have different cultures and everything is different, which is strange that you would have that, but you have very different cultures. And when you put those cultures together, they don't often go together very smoothly. So that started to create a problem. And by the 1980s, things were a mess over at Pan Am. You might remember this scene from Catch Me If You Can. This was the iconic Pan Am building that was down in Manhattan. That building is now MetLife Building, so I guess it's owned by an insurance company, but that's at 200 Park Ave in Manhattan. Pan Am had to sell that building for $400 million in 1981. Well, a few years later, they had to sell off their hotel chain for $500 million. So now we're talking about mid-1980s, and they are liquidating their assets quickly because they are bleeding money. Then they had to sell off their Pacific routes to United Airlines for $750 million. So they are losing all their routes, getting rid of their hotels, and as you can imagine, the overall experience of the airline is going down fast. But in the late 80s is where things really went downhill for Pan Am. Pan Am Flight 103 was brought down by a terrorist, placing a bomb on the plane in London that was headed out for New York. They were looking to create the biggest possible reaction by targeting one of the most iconic brands they could, Pan Am. And it worked. Everyone on board, including 11 bystanders that were on the ground in a small town in Scotland, ended up dying as a result of that accident. As you can imagine, this made all kinds of news. And by 1990, Pan Am had to sell their hugely profitable in-demand London routes. Pan Am went into bankruptcy. And the thing is with most businesses, as they start to get big, they start to get bloated with middle management and a bunch of people that aren't really producing anything. And that's what happened. And as they went into bankruptcy, Delta ended up acquiring them, and they were trying to revive and keep that airline alive as a separate brand. But the board realized that Pan Am was just a sinking ship and was never going to be able to be revived.
We are very sorry to advise you that Pan American Airways has suspended operations.
The legacy of Pan Am is still remembered today as probably one of the most iconic airlines to ever exist. And without a doubt, there's probably no experience you'll have on any airline that would be equivalent to your experience of what it would have been like flying on Pan Am in the 60s and in the 70s. What's interesting to me as an airline pilot is I've had friends go to certain airlines and they go, I'm so happy that I've made it to this airline, I never have to worry again. If you were a Pan Am pilot in the 70s, you would have thought life couldn't be better. I'm all set. You're with Pan Am. It was huge. It was a monster. Well, just in the 80s, it was totally collapsing. It can happen really fast, and as they say, history can repeat itself. So it's just something to keep in mind if you are an airline pilot or you're married to an airline pilot. Just realize that this monster that was huge, hugely successful ended up collapsing in a very short time span when you think about it. But if you ask me if there was any time that I could have been an airline pilot of any time, it would have been flying a 747 for Pan Am, especially in the 60s when the brand was really exploding and into the early 70s. That would have been so cool. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.